energy efficiency program savings and the sources of information about them that air regulators can use in their state implementation plans or in other resource planning purposes. So, there's a lot of interest out there among air regulators and the energy community in general about using energy efficiency to achieve emissions reductions or emissions avoidance and other related co-benefits. And so what we're going to talk about today is, with that interest, where can you go about finding information? How would you do that to actually include end use? We're talking about buildings here, the built environment, energy efficiency, information in the criteria pollutant state implementation plans, or for generally quantifying the benefits of efficiency. So this is, briefly going to talk about why you'd want to do that, and then get into two speakers talking about how you can go about getting the information that you need for these resources in the state implementation plans or other resource plans. The first, as Nico indicated, John Shenot is going to talk about a report that he's prepared with the Regulatory Assistance Project on energy efficiency data sources, and certainly get information about where that report is available and go through that. And then Cecily McChalicher is going to be talking about their specific database for the New England and Mid-Atlantic states. The format that we're going to have today is, once I conclude here and on the presumption of getting our webinar running, we're going to have two presentations, and then after each presentation have some time for clarifying questions as needed. And we're also going to do an interactive poll, which gives you, the audience, the opportunity to respond quickly, and we'll share the results on screen quickly for that. Then at the end of both presentations, we'll have time for general discussion. We also have a very short survey. It takes about half a minute at the end of the webinar to give any of your feedback that helps us improve the webinars going forward. So, in anticipation of our webinar starting, let me do a little more formal introduction for John and Cecily. John, as Nico indicated, is an associate in the U.S. energy programs of the Regulatory Assistance Project, which is a Vermont-based nonprofit. John's been with RAP since 2011, and prior to that, he was a policy advisor in the Public Service Commission in Wisconsin, where he worked on energy efficiency, renewable energy, and other related topics. Before that, he spent 15 years with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources as an air pollution regulator. So John provides us that straddling between the energy and air regulator worlds, which is a source of great opportunity and occasional language differences. And John knows a little bit about that because he also worked in a program in Bristol, England. So if he mixes up his S's and Z's, we'll have to forgive him for that. He has an engineering degree from the University of Maryland and a resource policy from the University of Michigan. Cecily McChalicher works for the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships Regional Evaluation Measurement and Verification Forum. So she has a very long title on her business card, and she specifically works on the Regional Energy Efficiency Database, which is called REED. Prior to that, she worked on other programs within the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships EM&V Forum activities. And before that, she was with the Minnesota Land Trust, where she worked on land protection and conservation. Cecily has a bachelor's degree in political science and a master's degree in urban and regional planning. So I'm hoping that we have a live webinar now, but not hearing from our facilitator. I'm going to assume not. John, maybe I can ask you if you might mind just doing a little sort of verbal versus visual introduction.
Eileen, don't mean to interrupt, but the webinar is live at this point.
Oh, great.
So I'm ready to hand the controls to Cecily.
Actually, let's start with John. So we're going to start with John's presentation first.
Great. John has the control.
Great. Thank you very much. And again, thanks everybody for your patience.
Good morning, everyone. Eileen, does that mean that the participants are live as well, or do we need to give them a couple of minutes to log in?
We have 160 folks on the webinar.
And they're seeing the visual, not just the audio.
They should be able to see the visuals, yes.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Eileen. And thank you all for attending this webinar. I'm starting to wonder if it was only the presenters who are having trouble logging in, and you've been wondering what we're talking about. In any event, today I'm going to talk about a new RAP publication, as Steve mentioned, and that's on quantifying the air quality impacts of energy efficiency policies and programs. And to be a little more precise, I'm going to focus my remarks on things that reduce the use of electricity. So I'll probably use energy and electricity interchangeably just for today's purposes. So for starters, I suspect that most or all of you get the core idea of this webinar. And that core idea is that if we promote efficiency and use less electricity, use it more efficiently, that power plants will reduce their output accordingly, and their air emissions will go down from what they otherwise might have been. I think this core idea is intuitively obvious, but the real challenge is quantifying the effect. Which power plants will ramp down and by how much? Where are they located? How much will their emissions decrease? These are tough questions to answer. But actually, before we even try to answer them and get into the data sources, let's talk first about some of the reasons why you would want to do this. And I'm getting a lag. Bear with me just 1 second. Okay. So for me, it all starts with this basic fact. The reason I'm interested in this subject is because energy efficiency has the potential to reduce air pollution by millions of pounds per year. On this slide, I'm showing you an example from the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin's a rather average state in terms of size and energy use. The state's energy efficiency programs are above average by most measures, by most accounts. But I would say Wisconsin has been a real leader when it comes to quantifying the air quality impacts of their efficiency programs. And I wanted to start today by showing you the kind of impact that good programs can have in an average-sized state. This table comes from a 2010 evaluation of Wisconsin's efficiency programs, and it shows that indeed, and literally, millions of pounds of air pollution were avoided by those efficiency efforts. Next, I want to explain 5 different reasons why you might want to quantify the emissions avoided through efficiency programs. And the first of these reasons has to do with determining whether your efficiency programs are cost effective. This will be relevant to some of the people on the call today and less relevant to others, but it's a key reason for quantifying these impacts. Utilities, regulators, policymakers, they're all trying to ensure that the benefits of any mandated efficiency programs exceed the costs. And there are 5 different standard tests that are used in the industry to make that comparison. They're shown in this table. Each standard test uses different categories of costs and benefits and tries to answer the question from different positions. Actually, the details here are not that important. What matters is that energy efficiency can reduce environmental compliance costs. Oops. Sorry about that. It can reduce environmental compliance costs and reduce the societal costs of air pollution, and those are important benefits that are supposed to be part of this cost-benefit calculation. So if we were to go back to that Wisconsin example, this slide shows the results from the most recent evaluation of costs and benefits of Wisconsin's efficiency programs. And what I want you to see here is that the evaluators concluded that the emission reductions provided a benefit worth over $140 million. And I also want you to see that that represents over 20% of the total economic benefits of those programs. So, you know, we think of energy efficiency as you save energy and that helps you save money. But the reduced emissions, in some cases, can be a big chunk of the benefits. And yet some states don't even try to quantify this. I would say that if you don't quantify the air quality impacts, you're underestimating the benefits of your efficiency programs, perhaps by a lot. And that sort of brings us to the second reason why you would do this. And that's, it has to do with long-range planning. And this is the kind of planning that most utilities do. They typically try to project the future demand for electricity and then figure out the cheapest way to meet that demand. And the images you see here are from a recent resource plan for the Tennessee Valley Authority. It shows their projections for electricity demand growth and shows the mix of new resources that they decided would be best for meeting that demand. The top line in the table says EEDR, and that refers to energy efficiency and demand response. It's a huge part of the TVA resource plan. And here's the point. When utilities develop these kinds of plans, they should be considering how they can reduce emissions and avoid environmental compliance costs through efficiency. If they don't, they're likely to select a mix of resources that costs more than it would if they included more efficiency. And I've included this slide just to drive home the point. It shows the levelized cost of electricity for different types of electric generating resources. This is a measure that's used in the industry to compare the average cost per unit of electric output over the lifetime of different types of equipment. And this, at the top of the chart, is what it costs to save a unit of electricity with energy efficiency programs. It's much cheaper. It's cheaper than any of the generation options. So we want our utilities to put a lot of energy efficiency in their long-term plans to keep electricity costs down. But if they don't include air pollution costs in their calculations of the benefits, they're going to underestimate those benefits and underinvest in efficiency. The third reason, which is probably the main focus of today's webinar, the reason for quantifying emissions avoided is for air quality planning purposes. And this map shows you all the counties in the United States that are not currently meeting at least one of the national ambient air quality standards. More than 150 million people live in these counties. So don't be fooled by all the white space. State, local, and tribal regulators are responsible for developing plans for improving air quality in these regions, and those are called state implementation plans, or SIPs. Energy efficiency programs can be part of those SIPs, but only if you can quantify the impacts. I already showed you that it's cheaper to save a unit of electricity than it is to build a new generator and produce that unit. But this chart shows something similar. It shows that efficiency is also the cheapest way to reduce air pollution. To help states develop SIPs, their air quality plans, EPA publishes and updates a menu of air pollution control measures. And that menu lists how much it typically costs to reduce 1 ton of emissions using various pieces of equipment or strategies. And on this slide, I've excerpted some data from the menu of air pollution control measures to drive home the point. Energy efficiency is the only measure listed here that simultaneously reduces all 3 of the pollutants. And also, for each pollutant, it's the cheapest way to reduce emissions. Why does it say that energy efficiency costs 0? Well, I did want to point out that's because the way EPA is producing this is it's assuming that only cost-effective energy efficiency measures would be used, meaning ones where the benefits over the lifetime of the measure exceed the costs over the lifetime of the measure. And as a convention, they assign that a 0 cost. Of course, there are limits to how much you can reduce emissions with efficiency. That isn't shown on this chart. And I'm also not trying to suggest that a utility could completely avoid the expense of pollution controls. But I'm saying that it makes sense to start by getting as much emission reduction as we can from efficiency. I'm not going to go over this table in much detail, but I wanted to reference it. This is based on EPA's roadmap for incorporating efficiency and renewable energy policies into state implementation plans, and that was published last year. the roadmap document encourages state air agencies to incorporate efficiency in SIPs. And it gives states 4 options or pathways for doing that. Some of the differences with each pathway are summarized here. And again, I'm not going to go into all of that, but you can refer back to this slide because each pathway has some things about it that make it appealing relative to the other pathways and some things that make it less appealing. You can refer to that later or refer to the roadmap document itself. But the most important thing you need to understand is that this comes from EPA, and EPA is clearly more receptive to using efficiency as an air quality strategy probably than ever before. And they're putting effort into it, and they're really working with states to make it possible. So the 4th reason you might want to quantify avoided emissions is to assess the potential benefits of new efficiency policies and programs. I think the air quality benefits should be a component of any debate over new policies. And again, if you ignore the air pollution benefits, you underestimate the value of efficiency programs. That's all I'm going to say about that. But this is a key reason for undertaking this kind of effort. And then the 5th and final reason to quantify avoided emissions is to justify and defend existing efficiency policies if and when the value of those programs is being questioned. Air is cleaner today as a result of past efficiency efforts. It clearly is. And yet that benefit is rarely mentioned when these kinds of debates occur, and it should be part of the conversation. Not the only part, but an important part. So that's it. Those are the reasons why you might want to quantify avoided emissions. And now it's time to talk about how you do that. As I already mentioned, RAP has just released a new publication on this topic, and that's going to form the basis for the remainder of my remarks. I hope you'll download a copy from the link shown here and use it as a reference because it goes into much greater detail on all the points I'm about to make than I have time to make today. So I began my remarks by citing some data from Wisconsin on the avoided emissions attributable to that state's efficiency programs. Sadly, in most states, you won't be able to find such data because nobody's done the analysis. Things are improving rapidly in that area, and Cecily is going to tell you about some great new activities in the states that she works with. But in the meantime, in most places, if you want to quantify air quality impacts of efficiency programs, you'll have to gather the data and perhaps even process some of the data yourself. So let's look at the basic steps in that process. It all begins with a baseline forecast of electricity consumption and the power plant emissions that are associated with that consumption. Most of you will never have to develop such a forecast. Instead, you're going to obtain the data from one of the sources that I will describe later in my remarks. The second step is to delve into the documentation of that forecast and figure out what assumptions were used when it was developed. Were any of your state's energy efficiency policies and programs considered when the forecast was developed? Maybe, maybe not. In other words, are some of those efficiency programs, are the impacts of those programs already embedded in the forecast? And I will say a little bit more about this later as well. The third step, if any of your efficiency policies are not embedded in the baseline forecast, we're going to call them incremental. And the third step is to quantify the expected energy savings from these incremental efficiency programs. Here again, you usually won't have to do that yourself. You'll usually be able to get this information from some data sources that I'm going to summarize. And then finally, in the fourth step, and this is the one you might have to do yourself, the one you're most likely to have to do yourself, is to estimate the avoided emissions from those incremental efficiency programs. This can be a fairly complicated undertaking, and I'm going to refer you to some of the methods and tools and reference documents for doing it. But it's complicated enough that we're not going to get into too much detail today. So I said step one is to develop a baseline forecast, or more precisely, to identify the forecast you're going to use, because you probably won't develop it yourself. I can tell you that EPA and state air pollution agencies typically use the AEO, which is the U.S. Energy and Information Administration's Annual Energy Outlook, as the default source for their baseline forecasts. It provides projections of energy use and emissions in different regions of the country. It's updated annually, but it does not provide state-specific data. It's broken down into regions that don't align perfectly with states. States are not required to use the AEO for their baseline projections, and I listed here a few other sources where a state might go to get an alternative forecast of future energy consumption. You could make an argument that some of these sources are more attuned to local conditions, and their forecasts might even be more accurate than the AEO. But so long as air regulators are using the AEO as the default data source in most cases, so long as EPA is doing that, state air regulators might choose to do so as well. I can say more about each of these during question and answer if anyone's interested, but for now I'm just going to note that they exist. So in step two, we decide which policies are already embedded in the baseline forecast. And for illustration purposes, let's assume you're using the AEO for your baseline forecast. I've looked through the documentation of the most recent AEO, and it indicates that the results include the effects of the policies on the left here, the effects of federal appliance standards and weatherization, of state renewable portfolio standard policies, RPS policies, but only where they're mandatory, not where they are expressed as a goal. And the AEO also includes the impacts of California's cap-and-trade program. But the AEO does not include the effects of the policies on the right. It does not include the effects of state energy efficiency resource standards, EERS policies. It doesn't include state programs that are goals, as I mentioned. It does not include the effects of utility energy efficiency plans if they, even if they're ordered or approved by the state utility commission. And the AEO projections do not include the impacts of state and local policies or tribal policies. The policies, again, in the left are embedded, and the ones on the right are incremental. If you were to use a baseline other than the AEO, the list of embedded and incremental policies would be different. But this would be what it would look like for the AEO. So let's assume that in your state, in your region, you do have some incremental efficiency policies that are not embedded in the baseline. The third step is to quantify the energy savings from those policies. And the appropriate sources for energy savings data depend somewhat on your purpose. If you want to know what benefit you're getting today from previously implemented efficiency measures, you generally want to look for an annual savings evaluation. Those are typically produced wherever efficiency programs are mandated by state law or by Public Utility Commission order, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute. On the other hand, if you want to estimate how much energy will be saved in the future by the efficiency policies you have in place today, you should be able to find estimates in utility integrated resource plans or utility energy efficiency program plans, and those are both typically filed with a state public utility commission. Also, if you live in a part of the country where an independent system operator, or ISO, manages the wholesale power market, then the ISO might also have a forecast of energy savings. And I'll show you an example of each of these data sources in a moment. And lastly, if you want to assess not what will happen as a result of existing policies, but rather what could happen, then energy efficiency market potential studies are one possible source of data. And those studies could be produced by a utility, a state agency, or someone else to determine the level of energy savings that could be achieved. And that's usually done as a precursor to deciding which programs to actually implement. And I'll give you an example of that as well. So this slide shows an example of the data you can get from an annual energy savings evaluation. And here again, I'm returning to the 2010 evaluation report for Wisconsin's efficiency programs. I've copied one of the tables from their report. It shows how energy savings grew over time from 2002 to 2010 because of a sustained policy requiring utilities to invest in energy efficiency. So all that data up to 2010 was actual energy savings, documented and verified. The graph also shows how savings might decline if the programs were terminated, might decline after 2010 if the programs were terminated. They weren't terminated, and that's not what's happening. That's just the way they did the analysis. But what you have here is actual numbers of how much energy has been saved in the past, and you could use that to calculate how much less air pollution was emitted in 2010 than otherwise would have been emitted. This slide gives you an example of the kind of data you might find in a utility's integrated resource plan, or IRP. And this one comes from Arizona Public Service. One of the challenges with using IRP data is that these plans tend to focus on capacity, which is measured in units of megawatts, rather than energy, which is measured in units of megawatt hours. It can still be really useful, but it does require extra steps to translate capacity savings into energy savings. And I'm not going to go into that right now, but if you have questions about that, you can check with me. The third data source, or an example of the third kind of data source, is the data you can get from the energy efficiency program plans that many utilities file with their state utility commission. And they usually do that to show how they will comply with an efficiency mandate. This example comes from the Colorado affiliate of Xcel Energy. Again, it shows the level of investment they're intending to make and the expected energy savings, incremental energy savings, that they expect to get over a near-term horizon. So the IRP is a long-term planning document. This energy efficiency program plan is generally a fairly short-term 1 to 3 year plan that utilities might file. But you can get really specific data about the level of energy savings they expect. My next example of data sources comes from an independent system operator, in this case ISO New England. ISO New England estimated the future savings in each New England state based on the incremental impacts of utility efficiency budgets, budgets that have been approved by each state's utility commission. And this is a kind of table that they intend to update annually. It's great if you're in New England, right? It's got the expected incremental energy savings year by year, state by state, and that's particularly handy for the kind of avoided emissions calculations that we're interested in. And then the last example I have of energy savings data sources, it's from a market potential study, in this case one commissioned by the Tennessee Valley Authority. And as is usually the case with potential studies, it shows the energy savings that are possible under a variety of hypothetical scenarios. So this kind of hypothetical or what-if assessment, it's probably not useful for regulatory purposes. You couldn't use this for a state implementation plan, but it can be really helpful for policy debates where you're deciding what should our policy be, what level of efficiency investment should our state or our utility undertake. And those are examples of all the data sources that I mentioned earlier. So the fourth step, after you've gathered your data on incremental energy savings, the last step is to quantify the avoided emissions that will result from those incremental savings. And as I said before, this is where it gets very technical, and I'm not going to go into the gory details, but I want to at least point you in the right direction. And in the new RAP paper, we point to 3 different methods for quantifying avoided emissions. The first method uses average emission factors for all of the affected power plants in a specified region. An emission factor tells you how much pollution is emitted for each megawatt hour of electricity generated, on average. These kinds of emission factors can be obtained from US EPA's eGrid database at the link shown here. You might be able to find similar data from an independent system operator. This, of the 3 methods I'm going to mention, this is the simplest and fastest. It's also the least accurate. I would say that it's a great method for screening purposes, where you're trying to decide whether there's possible bang for your buck here and whether you want to invest the time and effort to do a more rigorous analysis. That's what I mean by screening. This method might also be appropriate to inform a policy debate, but it's certainly or almost certainly not accurate enough to be used for regulatory purposes. The second method is called a marginal emission method, and these methods they're a little more sophisticated and a little harder to do, but they're also more accurate. There's a number of variations on these, but the basic approach involves looking at historical data on how power plants were actually used under different electric system conditions in the past. And then assuming that they will operate in more or less the same way under future conditions that resemble those historical conditions. So you use historical data to predict which power plants will be run at what level under different conditions in the future. And EPA's power plant emissions calculator, which is available from the link shown here, it's a really simple tool for applying one version of the marginal emissions method. EPA is also currently developing a second tool called AVERT that will use a different variation on the marginal emissions method, and we hope to see AVERT later this year. Then the third method for quantifying avoided emissions is based on dispatch models. These are computer simulation models that are widely used in the electric power industry to simulate how power plants are actually dispatched based on variations in customer demand for electricity. This method is the most accurate. It's the most likely to be accepted for regulatory purposes, but it's also the most complex and expensive. The computer models tend to be proprietary. Generally, it requires significant training to use them, and it's not something that you would enter into lightly. So finally, I want to leave off by citing some helpful references that provide much more information on this fourth step of quantifying avoided emissions. I've really just scratched the surface here. I go into greater detail in this publication, and so I'll start with one more shameless promotion of that RAP paper, and hope you'll forgive me for that. But there are other great references on this. I've listed here some references from US EPA and I encourage you to check these out after today's webinar. And also, if you're an air pollution regulator, to check out the roadmap, which I referenced on an earlier slide. EPA has a web page that's sort of home base for this topic of quantifying avoided emissions from energy efficiency. And they also published a great document on assessing the multiple benefits of clean energy, which includes avoided emission benefits. And by clean energy, they mean energy efficiency and renewable energy. I can't remember if there are other forms of clean energy in that document, but certainly efficiency is in there. And then finally, I listed some good references from other organizations here. And I hate to pick favorites, but I want to especially encourage everyone to look at the first reference listed here. It's a fantastic, concise explanation of the subject. It was developed by C-Action, a state and local energy efficiency action network. I believe Mr. Steve Schiller had a hand in this document, a significant hand in this document. And C-Action, one reason I really want to emphasize this one is that C-Action is a collaboration of stakeholders. It's not just presenting, the environmental regulators' point of view or an energy efficiency advocate's point of view. It's a collaboration of stakeholders representing different perspectives on energy efficiency, and they all came together to develop this program impact evaluation guide. It has an entire chapter, Chapter 6, on calculating avoided air emissions, and it's a fantastic reference. So there's some other things mentioned here, but in the interest of time, I'll suggest that you refer back to those, and that wraps it up for me. My contact information is shown here. I want to thank you all for the opportunity to talk to you today, and I'm looking forward to Cecily's presentation and some good question and answer. And with that, it's back to Steve Schiller.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, John, for a really thorough discussion of the topic. I have a couple clarifying questions. I'd like to see if it's possible to maybe touch on them in just a couple minutes and then move on to our first poll and then to Cecily's presentation. But the one was just a real basic one in terms of the AEO report. Do you know if it includes information on RGGI impacts?
According to the documentation, California's cap and trade program is factored into the forecast, the baseline projections. I'm struggling to remember to do this from memory, but I don't remember it specifically calling out the RGGI program. I'd be happy to follow up on that with whoever asked the question. But my recollection is that the documentation did not specifically refer to whether the forecast, whether the RGGI program impacts are embedded or not.
Oh, well, thanks, John. For the person who asked that question, if you want to just send back another question, and we can try to get the connection going on that. I'm probably somewhat presumptuous that they include the California program, which is relatively new. That you would think they would include the RGGI program, which is, I think, at 10 or 11 years now. So the next question is around the emissions factors. One was just sort of a general question about, for the slides you showed at the beginning, such as the Wisconsin, as to what emission factors they use for that or what sources, but then also a little bit more about the E-grid values, which you referenced in your presentation, obviously are pretty popular for use. If you maybe talk a little bit also in terms of the factors within E-grid, whether those values there are averages or non-base loads, or what the meaning is between using marginal emissions factors, average, base load, et cetera, factors.
Sure. So again, an emission factor says if you generate a megawatt hour of electricity at a power plant, how much of each of the different air pollutants is emitted per megawatt hour. What eGrid does is it's an EPA database that's based on the actual characteristics of all of the power plants in the United States that are above a certain size threshold, which is not a very high size threshold, so it's capturing most of them. And deep within the database, you can get all the information about individual power plants. But the part that's probably most useful for these screening exercises that I talked about are where they've compiled regional average emission factors. And you can get average emission factors for a variety of pollutants, for nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, and carbon dioxide especially. And here's the thing, that first of all, you need to understand that there's a time lag in their database. So they're giving you the average emission factors based on how the power plants operated in some past year. And the current, the most current version of eGrid is based on 2009 data. So there is a lag time, but it's also updated periodically. It's important to mention because the power plants that are on the system and how they'll run in 2015 is probably pretty different than how it was in 2009, just for example. But the other thing that I think Steve's asking about is the eGrid data will tell you average emission factors. It will tell you the average emission factors for the non-baseload plants. These would be the power plants that don't normally run 24/7 and the ones that are most likely to actually run less because of energy efficiency. There's also average emission factors that only look at fossil fueled power plants. Obviously, if you reduce the output from a hydroelectric plant, you're not going to change air emissions because they aren't burning anything. So the data are presented in a variety of different ways. We go over this in the paper that I wrote, and I generally suggest that people look at the non-baseload emission factors because those are just the power plants that might actually change their operational levels based on changes in customer demand from energy efficiency. I hope that answered the question.
I think it did, and I'm going to give you one more, which is sort of a general one. We did get a question, when we're looking at these emissions avoidance or reduction, they're really focused on the power plant emissions. There isn't a life cycle emissions calculation, say, for example, if there's a leakage issue in terms of, production movement out of state, or if, say, manufacturing of the energy efficiency technologies require more emissions. And I'll start off and see if you agree, if you have other comments, that typically that's not included because they're really considered to be somewhere between zero and de minimis in terms of their impact. Say, for producing a more energy efficient motor doesn't necessarily have a greater emissions footprint than a conventional motor. But I want to see if you had any comments on that sort of life cycle versus power plant.
Yeah, these methods and these data sources generally, or perhaps in all cases, do not consider life cycle emissions, upstream emissions. It's if you're burning a little less coal at a power plant because you don't need as much electricity, we're going to calculate the reduction in emissions at the power plant. We're not going to consider whether, there was one less train load that, ran across country delivering the coal, or whether there was some difference in the amount of natural gas produced to fire a natural gas powered plant. These are really just the the direct power plant emissions that are impacted by energy efficiency. But before I leave you, I want to say that in lots of places there are natural gas efficiency programs, meaning gas where it's used to heat homes, for cooking, for processes at manufacturing plants, that sort of things. Natural gas efficiency programs also reduce emissions, but they're generally much easier to quantify because the emissions are reduced by a piece of equipment where standard EPA emission factors would normally be applied. If there's a big gas-fired boiler that's used to produce steam in a factory, the air regulators know what the emission factors are for that piece of equipment, and they know if it's replaced by a more efficient boiler, then it's relatively straightforward for them to calculate the avoided emissions. It's much harder with electricity because the efficiency happens in a different location than the power plant, and that's why we focus our attention there.
Okay. Well, great, John. Thank you very much again. Really excellent job. And I want to now have a little bit of audience interaction. We're going to do a quick poll that you have an opportunity to respond to on your screen, and then we'll present the results from what the audience does. So I encourage you to participate. We're done with the poll. We'll move to Cecily McChalicher's presentation. A moment for participating in the poll. Remind folks that you're welcome to submit questions to the text box, or probably more appropriately the question box on your screen, and both clarifications and general questions. All right. I guess this gives us a sense of a lot of folks who are looking for efficiency for their emissions, and others where it's still to be determined. So with that, I want to turn the presentation over to Cecily McChalicher from NEEP to talk about their specific data source that they have that provides information as John was talking about. So Cecily, hopefully the controls are being turned over to you, and here we go.
Great. I think I have it, Steve. Thanks very much. So I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about READ and its role as a new source of energy efficiency data and resources for air regulators and other energy efficiency stakeholders. So my presentation will begin with a brief introduction to NEEP and the Regional EM&V Forum. I'll then turn to READ development and content, followed by an overview of how to access the READ reports and underlying data. And then I'll close with next steps and READ's future direction. So starting with just a very brief overview of NEEP, which manages READ. NEEP started back in 1996. It's working to keep the Northeast region a national leader in accelerating energy efficiency. We do that through collaboration, education, and advocacy. We have 4 main focus areas that are outlined here on the slide, and READ falls into the advanced knowledge and best practices focus area. So the Regional EM&V Forum is a project of NEEP, and it directly manages READ. The forum was launched back in 2008, and 10 states in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions participate. The center of this graphic shows the forum's main activities. Those are developing common EM&V methods, conducting joint research and evaluation, serving as an EM&V information resource, and also providing for common statewide energy efficiency reporting. And so those final 2 is where READ comes in. The outer circle outlines the forum's goals, and I highlight here the most relevant goal for today's presentation. and that's to provide consistent data and methods to support air quality and climate change reporting and planning. So to help achieve this goal, the forum's scope includes building a regional platform to help support energy efficiency data needs for state departments of environmental protection, the US EPA, and others. Sorry, I'm getting a bit of a lag here. Okay, there we go.
There we go.
So in 2009, the forum started to develop that common regional platform for energy efficiency reporting so that people could better understand the impact of energy efficiency across the region. So the first step in this process was to develop common reporting guidelines. And this was quite a challenging process since reporting practices vary by state. So the left side of the slide represents NEEP as the shepherd, trying to work with all the states to produce a set of reporting guidelines that all states supported. So forum participants did provide feedback throughout the development process, and the guidelines were finalized and adopted by the Forum Steering Committee in 2010. So the next step in this process was to implement the guidelines by developing READ. So in 2011, NEEP hired Peregrine Energy Group as the contractor to develop a public READ website and database. So in February of this year, READ was launched publicly. It currently includes program year 2011 electric and natural gas program data for 8 states in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions. So we're really excited to be able to provide a resource that provides for both transparency and consistency in reported efficiency data. And so the cats snuggled up to each other here on the right side of the slide represent the states coming together in support of common reporting through READ. We have been tracking use of the READ website since it launched back in February. We found that thousands of people from across the country have accessed the website for a variety of purposes. We see program administrators, public utility commissions, and other researchers. They can review and compare the data to identify best practices and modify and improve program design and policies. The data can also be aggregated to inform regional or national research on program impacts and policies. It can also be used to support system and transmission planning forecasts. And finally, and most importantly for today, air quality planners and regulators can use the data to support incorporating energy efficiency into air quality plans like state implementation plans. As far as sources of READ data, READ includes annual energy efficiency program data that's reported by program administrators to state public utility commissions or other similar entities. So for the New England states participating in READ, we developed a data collection arrangement with ISO New England through which the program administrators submit their electric program data to ISO to inform the ISO's energy efficiency forecast. ISO then sends that data file to NEEP, and it's imported into READ. So we're really happy to have this arrangement in place since it helps to ensure the use of consistent data across the region. We also collect natural gas energy efficiency data from the New England states, and the gas data then comes directly from the state PUC or program administrator. And then for all of the other states providing data to READ, which for this year includes Maryland, New York, DC, and Delaware, both the electric and gas energy efficiency data comes directly from the state PUC or program administrator. READ provides a variety of reports. I list them here. We have annual and lifetime energy savings, summer and winter peak demand savings, program expenditures, job creation impacts, program funding sources, as well as supporting information for reported energy efficiency program results. And we do also include avoided air emissions and the cost of saved energy, and those are calculated in the database using a methodology that forum participants agreed to use. This slide provides a little more detail about the avoided emissions report in READ. So READ provides avoided carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen oxide emissions. Avoided emissions are calculated in READ for this year using average annual emission rates for each subregion. So that's ISO New England, New York ISO, and PJM. And those were provided by foreign participants. So this is a methodology that the READ subcommittee recommended for this first round of reporting. And the subcommittee suggested that we use marginal emission factors in the future, and so this is something we're working towards. We first need to have agreement on a consistent methodology for using the marginal emission factors. So NEEP is involved in discussions with NESCOM, which is the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management, and others on this topic. So to keep you from having to look through large piles of documents like you see here, READ provides easy access to supporting energy efficiency program information. So this includes some of the information that John talked about. So we have links to technical reference manuals, energy efficiency plans, and annual reports, as well as potential studies. We also include information about EM&V protocols or methods used to support the reported program results. So I did want to mention here that a parallel EM&V forum effort is to develop increased transparency and consistency in the methods used to evaluate savings across the region. So in 2010, the forum issued some EM&V methods guidelines for some key energy efficiency measures, and we're just going to continue our work in this area. We also provide information about state reporting timelines and evaluation processes, and then we include energy efficiency forecasts. So right now we just include links to the forecasts in the READ region, but we're currently developing a standalone page on the READ website, and that will provide both the links to the forecast and then some basic descriptions of the forecast. So that web page should be up and going later this fall. So this is a screenshot from the READ website that shows the kind of background energy efficiency information that you can access. So I'm highlighting here Connecticut's program savings documentation, which is their TRM. And you can see that there's a link to that document on the Connecticut website. And then below that, at the bottom of the screenshot, you can see links to the program plans. Next, I'd like to go just a bit deeper into how to access the READ reports and the underlying data. So this slide here shows the READ homepage, and at the top you can see that there are several navigation buttons. If you select the Reports tab, then that allows you to navigate through the reports and access the underlying data. So this screenshot here is what you see when you select that Reports option. So the READ reports feature interactive data selection options. I'm showing here the energy savings report. And you can see on the right side of the slide that there is a drop-down box that allows you to select which energy savings values to display. And below that, which is kind of going off the slide, you can see you can select which states to display and then what year to display. So right now we just have the 2011 program data. But by the end of this year, we'll also have the 2012 program year data. Users can then also select the level of granularity to display. So right now, I'm showing the data at the program sector level by state. But you could also take a finer look at the data by showing the data at the program type level, or you could sum it up to the state level. READ allows users to download the reports to a PDF format in addition to viewing the data on the website. So this is just a PDF version of the state level report for annual energy savings. Then you can also access the program level data that underlies the higher level reports. So to view this data, use the drop-down menu in the upper middle part of the page and select the data option, which I'm showing here on the slide. A new screen then pops up that shows the program level data. So to make sure that all the data is displayed, you can just select the underlying tab on the top left side and make sure the Show All Columns box is checked. So then you can either view the data in the window or you can download it to Excel format, and that way it can be used for any spreadsheet-based analysis. So that was just a pretty brief overview of the reports in READ and the data. Just covering a little bit of the next steps. The next few months are a very busy time for READ. So this month we are working to complete and issue a READ Program Year 2011 Annual Report. So this report is going to provide a high-level overview of the 2011 energy efficiency program impacts at both the regional and the state level. And then we're also taking a closer look at several program types that have high levels of energy savings and outlining the differences across states in program impacts. We're also completing some minor improvements to the READ website and reports, and those are going live next week. The other big effort is we're currently collecting the program year 2012 data from the states, and so that should be publicly available on the READ website probably in November. And then next year in 2014, we'll be continuing our annual data collection effort with the 2013 data and issuing another annual report. We're also constantly making modifications to READ based on user feedback to improve it. And then another effort we may undertake next year is to conduct a regional job impact study. Right now we just have job impact data for a couple of states, and we'd like to expand that to all states. Some other things we're doing, we do recognize the need for increased consistency in definitions used in data collection efforts across the country. So we're coordinating with the Consortium for Energy Efficiency, or CEE, also with the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, ACEEE, and Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory to move towards greater consistency. We also plan to continue our coordination with NESCOM, RAP, and others, really working to provide some stronger links between the energy efficiency and air regulatory communities. So to that end, we invite state DEP staff and others in the air community to use READ and provide feedback to us, or even participate in the READ subcommittee if you're interested. So if you are interested in that, please just contact me. And that's it. So thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Cecily, for the information about your program and the valuable resource that's available for people interested in the subject of our webinar. I did have one clarifying question for you. In the report in the database, is the information there savings at the end use, so at, say, the building, or is it back at the power plant, at the bus bar? So does it include transmission distribution losses?
We provide savings at the, well, we actually provide both meter level and generator level savings. So both are provided. When I was showing the energy savings drop down, that's one of the options.
I see, okay. So I think we're going to turn to our last poll right now, but we might come back to that subject in sort of the general discussion for the last bit of the webinar here. So here's our next poll. Folks can respond and help give all of us here on the presenters as well as in the audience a sense of folks' access to energy information. Well, thank you very much for responding to that. We have a few general questions. I think overall, the general theme of the questions is, a sense of when looking at these reports, particularly as an air regulator looking at a energy efficiency impact report or the READ database, comments, John or Cecily, some suggestions or guidance you have about looking to where to find the right number. So we know within the efficiency world, we report cumulative savings, annual savings, life cycle savings, net savings, gross savings, the issue that was just mentioned about whether it's the reductions at the power plant, the generator, or if it's just at the end user. And then John, is in terms of, what emissions factors to use. The discussion that you were clarifying a bit on the average versus marginal for different types of measures of, say, a measure that has savings that occur at night. Say you're doing a efficiency project to reduce the lighting in parking lots. That's probably more of a base load type emissions reduction versus a project to reduce on-peak air conditioning, which would perhaps affect more of marginal emission rates. So with that, I don't know if either one of you want to comment on suggestions for the audience about things to think about, where to look for particular numbers that would be most applicable for the given circumstances that folks are looking for.
I do have some suggestions, and hopefully we addressed this pretty well in the paper that RAP wrote and in the C-Action paper that I recommended. So to begin with, I think to estimate the emission reductions at power plants, you have to understand that there is a lot of different ways to measure energy savings, and it'd probably take a whole webinar to define all the terms that Steve used there. I think there's some debate on which of these different flavors of energy savings are most appropriate to use, but near consensus will say that you want to find the savings value that is called net rather than gross. And the reason there is that the net savings value is intended to reflect the incremental savings that happen because you have an energy efficiency policy or program. The gross savings value might include some things that would have happened anyway, and in theory, those will be embedded in your baseline projection. So I would recommend that people focus on net versus gross energy savings. As far as the second thing, I believe that for air quality purposes, the best form of data to use is a version of energy savings, and I'm struggling because they use different terms in different states and jurisdictions. But in the Wisconsin example that I referred to, and I keep coming back to that because I used to work there, they call it life cycle savings. And what that means is if you picked a year like 2013, you would have an estimate not just of the savings you're getting this year from all the light bulbs and efficient motors that you've installed this year, but an accumulation of the savings that you're realizing this year from all the things you've done previously. And I focus on that because I think it's the best measure for comparing the air emissions that would happen with and without your energy efficiency programs. And then the last question you mentioned, Steve, I think ideally when you do this, you would look at not just the amount of energy that is saved by the customer when they put in an efficient appliance, but also the upstream savings, because when you save a megawatt hour of electricity at the customer's end, you actually save a little more than that at the power plants, because some of the electricity is lost through the transmission and distribution system. That's normal. And it actually means that the power plants are generating a little more than a megawatt hour to meet every megawatt hour of customer demand. And ideally, you would account for those system losses as part of the energy savings that you apply to your avoided emissions calculations. Sorry for the lengthy explanation there.
And I want to turn, thank you, and I want to turn to Cecily, but first I just got a quick question someone brought in about net. You know, net has a lot of meanings to different folks. In the context, I think John was speaking about net are the savings that can be attributed to the efficiency program that's under discussion. So this is addressing what could be used the terms surplus or additional in the air emissions context. So it's not the net savings, say, at a power plant. It's the net savings at the customer meter that can be attributed to the program that they're participating in versus, say, being a free rider. Cecily, I don't know if you have suggestions, in going through the database and some things for folks to particularly look for, or
Yeah, I think just going back to which numbers to use, I think our big approach is we try to provide for as much transparency as possible. So when you're picking which energy savings values to look at, you can see if you're selecting net or gross, meter or generation level. So we don't provide as much guidance as what to use. It's more just like showing this is what it is. And that's not always clear sometimes when you're looking at other sources.
Can I take this chance to answer a question that was asked earlier, which I had a chance to quickly look it up, and I want to be clear to everyone that the impacts of the regional greenhouse gas initiative in the Northeast states are embedded in the AEO forecast. They are embedded, so they would already be accounted for in their projections of energy use and emissions.
Thanks, John, for taking the time to look that up and respond to that one. We've got another couple of clarifying questions, Cecily, back on your slides. I want to ask one general one about the jobs numbers. I know we're focusing on air emissions here today, but jobs is one of the things that is a non-energy benefit of great interest, obviously, to a lot of folks. And you do include some values for that in the database. Can you talk a little bit about how those numbers are generated?
Yeah, we actually just had states report values that they had developed through their own studies. So in the READ database, you can see the values we have. I believe Rhode Island and Vermont provided values. And then we include links to the studies. So that will provide more information about how the numbers were calculated. It's not something that we do within the READ database itself.
So those would be, so to understand where those values came from, just as you said, you have to look at the reports, and those probably do vary by state, and yes, they're pure estimates, or whether there's analysis on the direct or the indirect or potentially the induced jobs that come from those.
Exactly, and that it's definitely an area that we're looking into, just either developing a common methodology so you can really compare job impacts across states, or we've also discussed next year just doing a regional job impacts analysis, so conducting one study that would show the regional impact overall.
And that's another area where there's some caution is required in using the values as to whether they represent jobs in the current year or over an extended period of time. Mm-hmm. And whether the somewhat straightforward calculation of just the direct jobs for doing the immediate efficiency work, although a lot of economists are finding that indirect jobs to support that installation, as well as the induced job creation, even just from people locally spending more money on goods and services in their community versus on energy costs.
Yeah, we recognize it's a pretty complex area, so we're just really starting to scope out what our study would look like next year. So.
And I think probably the last question I have here, and then we might conclude the webinar, Cecily, was on the air pollutants. There was a question on the air pollutants that you listed on one of your slides. They seem to be, and I don't have the slide in front of me, the criteria pollutants and not greenhouse gases. are greenhouse gas emissions something you're including in terms of the in the cost calculation, the value?
In the cost of saved energy calculation?
Yes, or in other places. I don't have the exact reference. I was thinking perhaps you knew for where you had, I guess, some check boxes of what pollutants are included.
Right. So in the avoided emissions report on READ, we just include carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides. We do a separate calculation for the cost of saved energy for the energy efficiency programs, and that doesn't incorporate any specific air quality benefits. It's just a energy savings divided by cost equation. Good.
Well, thank you very much. I want to, I think we can probably end our webinar a couple minutes early here. I want to thank our speakers again, John Shenot and Cecily McChalicher, for their time and presentations, and certainly to the US EPA and the State and Local Energy Efficiency Network for the sponsorship of this webinar. The presentations for this webinar should be up in a day or so at emvwebinar.org, as well as the presentations and materials from other prior webinars over the last several years on related topics. And lastly, I want to thank our audience for participating today. There will be a short, brief survey at the end when you sign off. If you could take a few moments to respond to that, to give us feedback, that would be very helpful. So thank you, and have a great day.